Hello and welcome back to HEMA Fight Breakdowns. Today we're going to be talking about Chandler Brown. Now, Chandler sent in a bunch of footage from some recent tournaments, and they wanted to do a breakdown of his style, particularly because it's a style that is unique in that it centers around a single opening move. Now, for a lot of people, their style is dependent on what they do in certain situations and how many tools they have in their tool bag, but I don't want to make it sound like having only one move is a bad thing, because in a lot of ways, having a style that is based entirely around one move can be extraordinarily useful and extremely competitive, because it allows you to focus all of your effort and training into perfecting that one move and your one opening attack to make sure that 90% of the time you don't need to know anything more than that. And then when you do, you have a tight loop of things you have to know to do after. So first thing we're going to talk about is the Zoofect in here, and particularly Chandler Brown's favorite technique and how he uses his footwork and his setup in order to get into the best possible position for that. So we'll watch the exchange one time here, and what it basically is the right side shield how. Now, looking specifically at the footwork here, you'll notice that right here, Chandler takes a step to his right, basically right as his opponent is coming forward with their own right foot. And there is a very good reason for this. And it has something to do with a concept in boxing called foot position. So in boxing and even in HEMA, foot position is basically all about the relationship between the position of the two lead feet. And particularly the ability for one lead foot to be in a particular position, inside, outside, close, far, to that lead foot. So particularly in boxing, it has to do with the power hand. So, if you're right-handed, you hit hardest with your right hand. And if you're fighting somebody who's also right-handed, the foot position you want to be in is to have your left foot on the inside and very close to your opponent's left foot. Why? Because the closer you are, and the closer you are to their left foot with your left foot, the better chance your left shoulder and your left arm has of getting in the way of their right arm. And something very similar is at play here with the right side shield how and Chandler's foot position. By taking this step off to his right side, he is taking his right side, his entire right side, his foot to his knee, to his hip, to his shoulder, and his right hand, and putting it closer laterally to the target that he's aiming for, which in this case is the upper left shoulder of his opponent. If he were to simply throw the right side shield how right from where he is directly in front of his opponent as he's stepping forward, there's a good chance that his opponent would not have to move his sword very far to his left side in order to windshield wiper his, shield how directly out of the way and to a safe position. By moving himself over to his own right side and towards his opponent's left side, he's giving himself more of a gap and more of a target to shoot for, which means that his right side shield how is going to be that much more likely to succeed. With this exchange, we're going to see something very similar, where, again, Chandler's going to start off with a lateral step to his right side, again, trying to line himself up with his preferred target for his right shield how. But what we're going to see different here is that Chandler starts with his right leg back, and he throws a fully committed passing step shield how. Now, this is something that you see a lot of people do, and it works generally because the extra commitment from the full passing step does a very good job of delivering a huge amount of force and speed towards your intended target. But in this particular case, this shield how misses, and we see what is basically the most fundamental follow-up to any missed and parried shield how, which is the low right zverk from his opponent. The reason you throw low right zverks 90% of the time after you parry a high left side shield how, or his left side, Chandler's right side, is because once you've parried up into your upper left opening, it makes the most sense for your sword to then go out and around towards the lower left opening of your opponent, because that's the one place that their hands are least likely to get to. It's the furthest distance of travel from your upper right opening to your lower left opening, so it's the best, most difficult to block target. However, as we see what happens here, is that right after this happens, Chandler sticks his arms out and his fists forward and attempts to stuff the zverko of his opponent by pushing all of his new weight and momentum and his new step with his left leg directly into the right hand of his opponent. And the reason this works, as you see here, where the blade of his opponent just has nowhere to go and can't quite make it to its target, is particularly because that stuffing right zverkows is a lot easier than stuffing left zverkows. because in order to get proper rotation with your right Zverkow, your hand, your right hand specifically, has to rotate all the way so that you create that angle where basically you point with your thumb and with your blade, your tip all the way to the target that you're intending to hit. If you can't get enough rotation out of your right hand, your blade will not be able to make it to the target. So if you put a lot of force forward into the right hand of your opponent, they won't be able to get that forward push with their hand, and they won't be able to rotate it, and they won't be able to get their tip far enough to make it to the target that it needs to make it to. So you can protect yourself from the most common follow-up of a missed Schielhau, the right Zverkow, by pushing all of your weight and momentum forward and going for that grapple. So with this exchange, what we see is the classic condition your opponent to an attack on their left side and then feint it and throw an attack on the right side. Left side, sorry. There's not a lot to say about this other than what has been said over and over again about other people's techniques, which is every single time you get someone conditioned to throwing what your primary entry attack is, it's worth it every once in a while to throw a mix-up, and then especially with a hand shot, to make sure that your opponent can't know exactly where your attack is going to come from every single time. And using this is a great way of just conditioning your opponent into looking for something that's not coming and then getting a sneaky hand shot in when they're not expecting it. So with this exchange, we're going to see another right side Schielhau from Chandler, but this time what we're going to see is it fail in a very unique way. And in this particular case, it's failing because it's a little bit too short and it didn't get the right amount of distance. And despite the fact that Chandler has pushed off with his right leg and is throwing that fully committed Schielhau with that passing step, he didn't quite make it far enough, and as a result, his opponent was able to push it out of the way. And part of the reason he was able to push it out of the way is because when, as I said before, you're looking to basically land those Schielhaus, you want a direct line from your shoulder to your tip to your sword, and that does not exist here, which means that he was missing out on a couple inches of crucial range. But it didn't matter so much. And in particular, it didn't matter because after this basically bind happens, Chandler lets the force of his opponent go through his sword and inappropriately push way too far through this bind, basically ruining his chance of throwing a follow-up cut off of this parry, and then throws a left Zverkow. And we see this work primarily because when you enter in strong binds, which you're going to have happen all the time when you're throwing Schielhaus, a lot of people will be so focused on trying to stay safe that they'll accidentally put way too much force into the bind that they reach when they successfully parry. And the result is that you can let that force go past, spill it off with a little bit of a hanging, and then Zverk around on the side that they have now left because they pushed way too hard. The other thing that this really helps with is that follow-up. Going back to the earlier exchange, if you remember, after the attack was parried, it was pretty easy to pull off and throw that right Zverkow underneath. But that required the person on the right here to have stopped the Schielhau and then stopped their own momentum and then throw the Zverkow underneath. This exchange is of particular interest because Chandler does something very atypical here, and that is he throws a defensive option first. If we watch this exchange very slowly, what we see is right about here, his opponent throws a very heavily committed Oberhau attack right as Chandler was looking to throw a Schielhau of his own. And rather than finish that Schielhau, he aborts it and throws it up over his head into a kind of impromptu hanging parry. And the reason this ends up working out is because whenever you throw the Schielhau, you're basically trying to cross your body line from your right side to your left side. And if you throw it with a little bit of an angle, as he does here, what can happen is that if it gets stuffed by a really, really heavy attack like it does here, it's pretty trivial to just spill that attack and that force over your own right shoulder while pushing your left hand straight up into the air and make it so that you turn your opponent's crushing blow into an overcommitment that you can capitalize on. So this exchange is of particular interest, not particularly because it shows up anything new. It's still going to be Chandler's right side Schielhau, but in particular because it shows where Chandler has a unique starting position with his sword and with his hands, and how, from a different angle, he sets up the exact position that he wants to be in before he throws the attack. In this case, this position right here. As you can see from when he started off, he continued to shuffle to his right a little bit until his opponent, almost mirroring him, exposed his left shoulder here and got into a position where Chandler's tip was perfectly in line with his target. Once that happened, of course, he then executed the technique by throwing his sword and his momentum forward, and most importantly, by crossing his hands from his right side to his left side. What this does with the Shio Hao, as I've said in other videos, is it clears your line of any attacks that your opponent might be throwing at you while you're executing your Shio Hao technique, and it covers the center line of your body by crossing from the right to the left and just getting in the way of whatever sword or attack or defense happens to be there. If, in this case, his opponent throws this left Oberhau thing to try to capitalize on the fact that he starts off in his right side position, he still sweeps across his body and gets away in the way of that attack and deflects it successfully off to the side, while of course delivering his own tip to his target and ensuring that he gets his sword exactly where he wants it to be first, and then is still defensively minded after it lands. So the last little bit to this rounded style is having another guard that you can do a lot of these plays from. In this particular case, it is a left Spreckfencer, and it comes in the form of not necessarily a Shio Hao anymore, but much more of a flicking flat thrust straight to the face. And the reason this works is that if you can throw your favorite technique from a bunch of different positions, guards, and, stances, you can disguise your intent while still doing the thing that you're best at. And that's an important feature to have if you want to have a style that works. Because eventually someone is going to figure out what you're doing every single time you enter range, and they're going to start predicting and planning against it. But if you can throw the exact same techniques from different positions and disguise what you're going to do, well, then your opponent's going to have a much harder time figuring out what it is that you're trying to do, even though you're just going to do the same thing again. All right, that's going to be it for today. If you'd like to see your own footage featured on the channel, feel free to send an email over to HEMAFightBreakdowns@gmail.com, and I hope to see you next time.